This is the most important video that you'll watch this week. While the issue of slavery is not new, there has been an increasing interest in it, especially after the topic of reparations is brought up. A historian went into a debate with Cambridge students on the subject of slavery and colonialism, and the result wasn't so pleasant for them based on their reactions. It's important that before we delve into this, I'd like to state that I regard slavery as a crime against humanity and do not advocate for it. With that disclaimer out of the way, let's watch this clip.
In recent months, we've seen the issue of slavery and colonialism expand beyond campuses, as we've now got, of course, from Barbados to Jamaica, prominent Caribbeans also calling for Britain to pay reparations for slavery and the consequences of colonialism. And Madam Speaker, were we engaged in this debate in 1807 or 1833, I likely would have crossed the floor to support the motion opposite, because, of course, the victims of the horrendous horrors of slavery would have been alive and deserving of damages. But it's not 1807, it's not 1907, it's not even 2007. Over 2 centuries have passed since Britain led the world as the first empire in history to abolish slavery, and the right of reparations died long ago, because reparations are fundamentally about matters of tort law. The purposes of damages, reparation, is to restore the victim, the slave, to the position they were in before the damage occurred, slavery. The actual victim only can receive damages, not their descendants. And therein lies the rub, because some 6 or 7 generations separate those alive today from their British Empire slave ancestors. And whilst not just yet, thank you so much. Whilst it's undeniable that 19th century slaves suffered unspeakable horrors, in what way can this lead one to conclude that their great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren are also victims and deserving of reparations too? On the contrary, from Britain to the Caribbean, the descendants of slaves today have a far better and higher quality of life than they would have had their ancestors remained in Africa. And that's an indisputable fact.
While acknowledging the historical injustices of slavery is crucial, framing reparations solely as compensation for past wrongdoings reinforces feelings of victimhood among the descendants of slaves. Instead of empowering individuals to overcome adversity and achieve self-determination, reparations cultivate a sense of helplessness and entitlement. Additionally, focusing exclusively on reparations as a solution to racial disparities, we neglect the broader efforts taken in dismantling systematic barriers and promoting equal opportunity for all individuals, regardless of race. U.S. Representative Burgess Owens explained the idea of creating a victimhood mentality, and I quote, "At the core of the reparation movement is a divisive and demeaning view of both races. It grants to the white race a wicked superiority, treating them as an oppressive people, too powerful for Black Americans to be able to overcome. It brands Black people as helpless victims devoid of the ability which every other culture possesses to assimilate and progress." The pro-reparation groups argue that European Union countries and the United States only issue emptied, worded statements when it comes to slavery, but that's simply not correct. The mentioned countries, which were slave owners at one point in history, took clear actions to address this issue, and it no longer exists in our modern societies, legally, thanks to those actions. For instance, in the United States, a civil war was fought on the issue of slavery, which saw a legal end for the 1865. Additionally, in 1964, civil rights was passed in the United States Congress. This prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. I think that's great. In the British Empire, slave trade was officially abolished in 1807. However, slaves were freed in 1833 with the adoption of the Abolition of Slavery Act, converting enslaved people into apprentice laborers and taking steps to protect their work and well-being.
If you let me carry on, I'll tell you why. Well, first I ask you, is a current descendant of a slave ethically entitled to benefit from their ancestors' sufferings? And who should pay? Is it ethical for an innocent person today to be culpable for the sins of their forefathers? Now, CARICOM, which is the Caribbean body calling for reparations, wants British taxpayers to pay. But why? Out of a population of millions, there were only 3,000 slave owners in Britain. The vast majority of the population of Britain descend from people whose lives were one of abject poverty and hardship, working in hellish conditions akin to serfdom. Why should they, as taxpayers, pay reparations? It's not just yet, thank you so much. 16% of the British population is now also foreign-born, so why should they pay for reparations? What about the descendants of slaves living in Britain today? Why should people from Trinidad and Tobago living here pay reparations to people in Jamaica? Then again, why is the demand for reparations always focused and framed in terms of Britain? Why are no activists asking for reparations from the African states that were equally complicit in slavery? Should they not pay reparations? They provided the slaves that were transferred over the ocean, and millions more slaves were kept in slavery in Africa by other Africans, just as were being transported across the Atlantic. Why does nobody ever actually speak about that unpleasant truth? What about the Arabs and the Muslims who bought and sold African slaves for centuries before the British arrived and continued to do so into the 20th century until the British and the French tried to stop it? And indeed, what about the slavery that carries on today? The International Labour Organization says that currently approximately 7 in every 1,000 Africans is a slave. 10 million people. In 2017, CNN reported hundreds of slaves are sold every week in Libya. So much energy is given to historic reparation and the historic plight of slaves. I would have more time for the argument if the people actively pursuing that course of action were equally vocal about surely the far more horrendous plight of slaves today, where there are more slaves today in bondage, in slavery, than crossed over the Atlantic. So where are the protests outside the Nigerian High Commission? Where are the protests outside the embassies of Niger, which has 800,000 slaves today? What about Mali and Chad and Sudan and Cameroon? It's almost as if there's an ulterior motivation behind the call for apologies and reparations exclusively from Britain. And how far should we take this? Should Britain seek reparations for the Barbary slaves? 1 million Europeans, at the same time as Africans were going over the Atlantic, 1 million Europeans were enslaved by the Ottoman states of Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. And it carried on after the abolition of the slave trade by the British. Should Britain demand reparations from North Africa? Of course not. It's time to move on, and so should we.
Those are some interesting stats that you never hear about in the mainstream media. One aspect related to reparation that no one talks about is who gets to place a value on the impact slavery had. Is it monetary? If not, what is the value? I think determining the value of the impact of slavery is a complex question that extends beyond monetary considerations. This is not to say that it is outright an impossible task. That's not how those seeking reparations think, however. Take, for instance, the US Representative Cori Bush, who proposed a bill requiring a minimum of $14 trillion in reparations to address the issue. It's important to note here that the US national debt currently stands around $34 trillion. That's an absurd number. The real value of addressing the legacy of slavery should lie in promoting justice, reconciliation, and healing within society, rather than in monetary compensation. Former UK Minister Rory Stewart holds a similar belief, arguing that, and I quote, "Aid should be targeted to help the poorest people in the world rather than paying reparations in some weird belief that we're going to somehow undo 304 years of colonialism by writing a check to people." Another crucial point in the debate over reparations is that who will pay them should they happen, and who should be the beneficiaries. For instance, in the context of the United Kingdom, a Reuters investigative report found that less than 0.1% of people living in Britain held slaves during the era of the transatlantic slave trade. Now, if we consider that the UK is required to pay reparations to Caribbean and African countries that would be considered collective guilt, we don't blame gun owners for mass violent shootings. The issue of determining who should be eligible to receive reparations adds another level of complexity, since we have to go back at least 2 centuries. Put in simple terms, the current generation shouldn't be held accountable for past actions they weren't a part of, and it's unfair to compensate those who weren't involved.
Let's turn away from slavery and expand our view to colonialism more broadly. What disadvantage has colonialism actually caused to those living in the former British colonies of the Caribbean? And disadvantage compared to whom? And this is to go back to the point that you asked. Most of the former colonies of the Caribbean are now successful middle-income countries. The GDP per head of the Bahamas is higher than Portugal and is comparable to Spain and Italy. You never hear that, do you? Barbados, Antigua and Barbuda, St. Kitts and Nevis, and other former British slave colonies have higher rankings on the UN's Human Development Index than Brazil, Mexico, or many other Spanish-speaking South American countries. How has the British Empire disadvantaged the Caribbean nations? It's not clear to me. But let's test this further, and let's go and look and compare the nations of the Caribbean with modern West Africa, the original homelands of Caribbean slaves, to see what life is like there. GDP per capita in Benin is $1,430. In Barbados, it's $17,000, over 10 times higher. Life expectancy in Benin is 62, in Barbados it is 79. So rather than writing checks to well-off areas of the world, why not focus on countries and areas that are actually impoverished and require aid? Financial aid not attached to alleged attempts to cleanse one's soul. It can't be clearer. While slavery was abhorrent for those who were enslaved, had they stayed in Africa, the lives of their descendants today would be unquestionably worse. So what exactly actually is Britain being asked to pay reparations for? Because Britain wasn't the first empire in Africa, in India, in the Americas, but it was the most benign, and the benefits from it far exceed those, for example, of the Islamic and Indian empires that carved up India, of the Ashanti Empire, of the Dahomey Kingdom, and all of the hundreds and thousands of slaves that were ritually sacrificed every year in Benin. And the Benin Bronzes were mentioned. The Benin Bronzes commemorates those who actually owned slaves. So whilst on the one hand I can understand why you would protest Coulston's statue, why is there a celebration of the Benin Bronzes when they also commemorate slave owners? So why are we apologising for Britain? Are we apologising to Britain for introducing nutrition and food storage policies that led to a decline in the subcontinent's processes of famine that happened every 40 years in India? There was a famine. The population of India soared from 170 million to 450 million over the course of the Raj because of medicine, health, and accurate and proper nutritional standards and food storage compared to how it had been. There had never been in history of India such a surge in population growth. And let's not forget also what Britain did for women's rights, because I think it's fair to say that it's thanks to the British Empire that we have had the progression of women in Africa and India through society. Because, of course, India's history is one of female oppression. It was the British who abolished sutti, the burning of widows on the funeral pyre of their husbands. It was the British that stopped the infanticide of young girls. And it was the British who allowed Hindu widows to remarry. I'm sorry if you don't like the facts, but facts are actually facts. Universities were brought into Africa and India by the British. It's quite... There will be no system of democratic legislatures within these regions. But I'd like to end by quoting the great black civil rights activist and socialist Bayard Rustin, a friend of Martin Luther King Jr.'s and posthumous recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom from Barack Obama, who said, "If my great-grandfather picked cotton for 50 years, then he may deserve some money. But he's dead and gone, and nobody owes me anything." Thank you.
There's a lot to unpack here. Colonial administrations invested in the development of modern infrastructure included roads, railways, bridges, and ports. These projects facilitated transportation and communication, connecting remote areas to urban centers and enabling the movement of goods, people, and ideas. The establishment of modern transportation networks like roads, railways, and ports lay the foundation for economic development and trade, stimulating commerce and facilitating the flow of resources within the beyond colonial boundaries. The most notable of which is the creation of the Indian railway system, which in 1901 were the longest in the world when measured by route mile. What's interesting is that these infrastructure projects still exist to this day and all former colonies are using it, although in certain cases there have been no improvements to them. A chilling World Bank report of 1996 noted, and I quote, "Almost every African country has witnessed a systematic regression of capacity in the last 30 years, the majority had better capacity and independence than they now possess." On the other hand, many successful former colonies built on the valuable aspects of colonial heritage and are currently regional leaders, these countries have leveraged the positive legacies of colonialism to build strong institutions, foster economic growth, and promote social development. Additionally, colonialism brought technological advancements to colonized regions ranging from agricultural innovations to medical breakthroughs and industrial technologies. These advancements improved living standards, increased agricultural productivity, and enhanced public health outcomes. By introducing new technologies and scientific knowledge, colonial powers contributed to the modernized of colony societies and laid the groundwork for future development, which many former colonies built on and are currently regional leaders. These countries have leveraged the positive legacies of colonialism to build strong institutions and foster economic growth. From a societal standpoint, colonial powers established education systems in many colonies, although the primary goal was to train local elites in assisting with the administration of colonial affairs. Despite their limitations, these education systems provided opportunities for some individuals to gain literacy. This led to the emergence of an educated class, which contributed to increased social mobility and played a role in post-colonial governments and development. I think it's important to recognize that colonialism and its negative effects as well, and its legacy continues to shape the reality of post-colonial societies. However, the acknowledgement of its positive aspects challenges the simplistic narrative that portrays colonialism solely as a force of oppression and exploitation, which is mainly built on cherry-picking the available data. By examining both the positive and negative legacies of colonialism, we gain a deeper understanding of its impact on former colonies.